So, welcome to tonight's session. I'm Diane Cunningham, Trustee at the London Society and Director of the Assembly Line. We're holding tonight a discussion on local high streets. Those of us who don't know much about the London Society, we're a society that cares about London's past and is interested in its future. We host lots of regular events like this one, and pre-COVID there were lots of kind of visits out and about to London landmarks as well. So in this evening's panel discussion, we're taking a look at the recovery from the lockdown, perhaps so far, given latest changes this week, and the different responses from both local neighbourhoods versus central London. Much has changed in the last 6 months, and it looks like the next 6 months are going to be just as changeable. And we're going to take a look at how local high streets are kind of recovering with quite a strong recovery in the suburbs and outer London, while central London is having quite a different time of it. And we're delighted to have with us this evening 3 panellists who are all actively involved with high street recovery and understanding the current picture. We've got Erica Belcher, a senior researcher from Centre for London, the capital's dedicated think tank. She's co-authored many reports on London's economy, city planning and the management of public spaces. And Erica will present the latest economic data from the Centre for London for us tonight, showing how the economy is progressing as we go into the next phase of lockdown and reopening. We have Nicola Grant, who's Executive Director at Positively Putney Business Improvement District. Nicola's worked in regenerating town centres and place management for nearly 20 years. Firstly within Wandsworth Council. For the last 3 years, she's been running the BID. She's passionate about bringing stakeholders together, and she will share information with us about what's happening on the ground in Putney as an example of local high streets and what's happening in the recovery there. We also have Paul O'Grady, who oversees the strategy and performance of Grosvenor's Belgravia portfolio. His focus is on driving the future success of the area, working with partners and local communities. And he's previously held roles in investment, asset and portfolio management for Grosvenor across Europe, so has a really good wide-ranging experience of different high streets and neighbourhoods. And Paul will be discussing what Grosvenor are doing to bring customers back into central London. So each of our panellists will give a short presentation, followed by an opportunity for you to put your questions to them. And we'll take questions at the end. We'll go through as many as we have time for. So if you have questions at any point during the presentation, please pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll take a look at the end rather than after each presentation. We're aiming to wrap things up by 7:30. So first up, we're going to hear from Erica, who's going to take us through Centre for London's latest data on the recovery.
Thanks very much, Dan. Thanks for having me here tonight. Let me share my screen and I can pull up. So thanks very much for that. And it's a real pleasure to be here tonight and present to you some of the work that we've been conducting at the Centre for the last 6 months. I've been looking into the economic data with my colleagues Nico Passetti and Dylan Anderson, and it's a real, I say a pleasure, but it's not all good news. So I use that phrase lightly, but I'll talk you through how COVID and the lockdown is affecting London's economy. One measure we can use to look at how London is changing and how it's being affected by the crisis is London's job market data. London's performing the weakest of all UK regions. Job numbers, or rather job advertising numbers, are about 55% down on their level at the same time last year, and that's the lowest of all UK regions. And we know that's largely driven by London's large share of hospitality jobs, large share of retail jobs, and large share of jobs in the creative industry, all of which have been hit pretty substantially in the last 6 months. And this is hitting lower income outer London residents the hardest. When we look at the take-up of the job retention scheme at the borough level, we can see that there's quite a lot of variation there. And in places, in particularly in northern outer London boroughs, take-up's been the starkest. And you compare that with that kind of light patch up on the screen now in inner London, and the picture looks quite stark. Across the capital, Londoners are continuing to avoid public transport, and we know that now, and that continues to be the case. And that's the case across its network. I pulled up 3 stations on the screen here: Canary Wharf, Oxford Circus and Balham, and you can see that there's not a great deal of variation between those 3. In Canary Wharf, figures are down 72%, Oxford Circus 66%, and Balham 62%. So we know that Londoners are travelling less. They're travelling less around the capital, and they're travelling more in their local areas. They're steering well clear of workplaces, and we can see up on the screen now we've got data from Google Maps users, and that shows that trips by journey type show quite a lot of variation. Workplaces have remained well below average, but compare that to something like parks. We've seen a lot more trips to parks, and whilst that fluctuates with the weather, it remains consistently above the levels that we saw last year. And that shifting consumer spending to smaller town centres, we can see up on the screen here transaction numbers from a number of different London geographies. And when we look at the pattern of transaction during the months of lockdown and coming out from that lockdown period, we can see that there's been quite a different level of bounce back. We look at the kind of the consistent declines in the West End and in the central eastern areas of London, compared with some of the bounce back that we've seen in areas like Southall and East Ham, where transactions have bounced back to pre-crisis levels, particularly in grocery and food stores and in clothing stores as well. And this is from January to July, so we can see that eating out actually bounced back before the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was introduced. So quite strong signs of resilience there. But across the capital, business performance remains relatively weak. Up on the screen, we've got data from a survey of London purchasing managers, and it measures monthly growth compared to the previous month. So whilst we can see that in early September, growth has started to emerge, that growth is only relative to what came before. And what came before there is a pretty substantial drop-off. In fact, we can look at that compared to, say, the decline we saw in 2016 during Brexit, and well, it just doesn't really compare. It's so incredibly stark. So any growth we're starting to see needs to be taken kind of in context, and it certainly is not guaranteed to feed through into any growth in GDP in the short to medium term. And what does all this mean for London's property market, London's commercial property market? Well, it's taking a real hit. The decline in demand for office space is pretty stark. And up on the screen now, we've got measures of take-up and measures of active demand, as well as the vacancy rate. We know that the demand for office space is changing, and we don't know how that's going to change in the long term, but we can see that in the short term, it's certainly causing a lot of uncertainty and a lot of volatility in the market. We'll be monitoring all of these data on a quarterly basis. It's an incredibly fast-moving picture, so I was asked to give this bit of a snapshot, so I hope I've kind of set the scene and look forward to hearing more about how it's feeding through into these local areas by the next panellists. Thanks very much for having me as part of this discussion tonight, and I hope we can work more with the London Society going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today about our experience in Putney. I have been running the Positively Putney Business Improvement District since it became operational in April 2017. I was born in Wandsworth, and although I do not live in the borough anymore, I'm very passionate about the area. Putney is most famous for the Oxford and Cambridge boat race held in early spring every year, which sadly was cancelled this year. This itself was a massive blow for Putney's hospitality businesses, who rely on that day to make significant amounts of income. For those who don't know, Putney is in southwest London within the borough of Wandsworth. Putney is located on the River Thames, with Putney Bridge going from Putney into London via Fulham. Although Putney is just 6 miles from central London, it feels miles away. Putney has lots of green space, lots of beautiful houses, and has a strong community spirit. Putney is popular for exercising outdoors, especially for rowers, runners, and cyclists. Although a quote from 1903, I couldn't say it better if I tried. And thus we take leave of Putney, one of the pleasantest of the London suburbs, as well as the most accessible. The immense increase in the number of houses in late years testifies to its popularity, but there is still an almost unlimited extent of open ground which cannot be covered. And with wood and water, common and hill, there will always be an element of freshness and openness in Putney, seldom to be obtained so near London. Putney has great accessibility. It is served by mainline railway trains to London Waterloo and by London Underground from East Putney or Putney Bridge tube stations. It has 16 bus routes and 7 night buses. Putney Pier is served by the River Bus to and from Blackfriars. Putney Bridge leads into Putney High Street with Upper Richmond Road coming across in a T, which is part of the TfL Red Route network. In the London plan, Putney is identified as one of 35 major centres. According to the 2011 census, Putney has a population of 77,000 people, with 46% of residents classified as higher managerial and professional socio-economic status. The average 3-bedroom house is £700,000. With all this going for it, you would expect it to be a vibrant town centre. It was a great retail high street of the 80s and 90s, as it had limited local competition, a great range of independent boutiques in small units on Putney High Street. Daytime trade was boosted by large office blocks along Upper Richmond Road. It became a victim of its own success, and the national chains wanted to come and priced out the independents. It became a clone town of the early 2000s, and the local residents started shopping elsewhere. Either that was in central London whilst they were commuting, online, or in the improved local town centres. Meanwhile, permitted development rights changed the office blocks to residential, losing vital daytime trade. Car ownership increased. Putney High Street is the most direct route into London from the A3. It's a narrow road with high buildings and lots of traffic, which results in poor air quality. We have a number of absent landlords with substantial planning applications, but sitting on properties with increasing vacancy, and we have areas that look very run down. And this was all before COVID hit. As retail demand has reduced over the years, we had a thriving nighttime economy, with residents returning late at night wanting to eat and drink, and at weekends, large rowing events and regular Fulham football crowds. Putney is also in the final round of the government's Future High Streets Fund, with a vision of how do we make Putney great again. As Putney reopened, we knew that people were anxious about visiting. We made sure that Putney was and is safe to visit. We undertook COVID secure risk assessments with all the small businesses that didn't really know where to start. We've always known Putney has narrow footpaths and have been working with Wandsworth Council over the last 3 years on a comprehensive programme of widening them. The work was midway through as lockdown hit. We used the opportunity to put in temporary widening, and utilising the theme of rowing, we had playful social distancing stickers and queue management floor graphics made, which were very well received by the businesses and the locals. We've undertaken regular cleaning of all the high touch points to reassure nervous people of the transfer of the virus. We've recently made a film highlighting the measures that businesses have put in place. Businesses are working so hard to keep people safe. We shared this on social media to reassure nervous visitors. We spent various time improving the environment. We painted windows of the empty units, celebrating rowing in Putney. They were decorated by an artist with the theme of rowing and river, and they've been appreciated by our local residents and are brightening up the town centre. The parklets we actually ordered pre-lockdown as part of our aim to make the town centre more green and welcoming. We have no idea how popular they were going to become. As the lockdown weeks progressed, we were thinking about the change in people's lifestyles and the new way of working as an opportunity for Putney. We knew that our office sector hadn't returned and were not going to return for the foreseeable future. We knew we had lots of local residents who commuted into town and didn't have the time to use the Putney facilities normally. Thinking about the increase in desire to support locals, we wanted to make sure that these people continue to support them. These people are working from home for the foreseeable future and possibly forever. How did we attract them into Putney? One of the ways was via social media. We knew that social media had increased and the average person was on their phone for over 3 hours a day. So using local businesses and residents, helping us to tell the story of all the great aspects of Putney, using the hashtag #ShareOurPutney. In the last month, our organic reach was 50,000 people. Through the Share Our Putney campaign, we've strengthened our community of independent businesses. We have business owners who have told us that they have owned businesses in Putney for 20 years, yet they didn't know their neighbours, and they've never felt so much a part of Putney. These businesses are now recommending each other to their customers, both physically and virtually. I strongly believe that we've helped them through this pandemic, both emotionally and financially, and made them stronger for the future. Now we need to look for the future. Next steps for us is a survey. What do these new people want in their town centre? How can we get them to come into Putney on a daily basis? Is it workspace? Is it specialist shops? Is it coffee shops? We've always run an employee loyalty scheme for people who work in Putney to get daytime deals and special offers to encourage daytime spend. Next week, we're launching a similar scheme for residents where they collect points, which we're calling rewards, to spend back in Putney businesses. The aim is it will encourage people to discover new businesses that they didn't know exist. Our businesses before this week were reporting about 60% of last year's figures, and on the whole were very positive about their own and Putney's recovery. We have had many casualties, and we know that we're going to have many more in the future. This week has been really difficult. The uncertainty that it's brought is now making the once positive businesses very nervous about the much required Christmas trade that they need to see them through this year. We just hope it's not as bad as the last few days are suggesting. Please follow us on social media if you want to find out any more. Thank you.
Well, hello and good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for listening. I'm very pleased to be here, albeit virtually. Clearly there have been some important developments over the past few days, which I will of course touch on, but what I wanted to do today is to give you an overview of our response of Grosvenor as a major central London landlord to the pandemic, and to explain what we're seeing on the ground. Landlord responses to this crisis have been very highly publicised, so I thought it would be interesting to give a bit of colour on that today from the point of view of Mayfair and Belgravia. So firstly, central London is lucky in one way compared to Nicola's presentation, for example, where large swathes of it are owned by large estates or property companies with very low levels of debt, strong balance sheets and a long-term perspective. And these attributes have allowed us as Grosvenor to share in the short-term pain of our occupiers, and in order to help our estate weather the storm, but also aid our tenants' recovery. Because clearly our key objective at the moment is to get through this tumultuous period with as many as possible of our businesses intact and as few long-term effects as possible. And so we have approached this from a whole manner of different angles. And it's fair to say it has been an ever-moving feast, but there are some interesting things to pick up on. And since the very beginning, we have actively worked to support our tenants through this period. And the newspapers like to talk about the financial aspects, and I will touch on these briefly, but it is so much more than just rent. So in Q2, casting our minds back to early March, we acted very quickly in order to support our retail and hospitality tenants. And we wrote off their Q2 rent just after lockdown was announced. And this was in order to give them breathing space for what for many of them was just a terrifying few days and weeks. Businesses stopped overnight, and for many of our independent businesses with no or little online presence, turnover dropped to zero in 24 hours. But what we always knew, and has become ever more apparent, is that every case is different. And every case depends on all different factors: the location, the access, an occupier's access to government support, its customer base, its balance sheets, its online presence, its adaptability. And so from Q3 onwards, we have applied a bespoke approach to every single discussion with our retail tenants. So whereas in Q2, we had this initial offer that was extended to all, from Q3 onwards, we now really rely on our well-capitalised companies to pay their rent in order for us to be able to help those most in need. And some of you might have seen the representations made by the British Property Federation, BPF, on behalf of landlords to this effect. with regard to the moratorium on rent, but these were of course not taken on board by the government last week. But what is more clear than ever, and especially as a result of the last couple of days, is that this situation is by no means over, and the effects of this will in many cases be long lasting. But as I said, rent is only one aspect. And as a landlord, or as a good landlord, we are not there just to collect rent. And that is even more the case since COVID. So whereas the financial support helps businesses through short-term cash flow difficulties, it is the non-financial help that really aids the recovery of the area. And Nicola's touched on some of these examples from Putney, and there are a few, we have some similarities, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about what we have been doing in Mayfair and Belgravia. So of course, the public-private partnership is crucial at times like this, and we have been working very closely with Westminster Council, who have been very supportive. And right after lockdown lifted, we funded pavement extensions and planting to create restaurant terraces on our streets. And we did this for a number of reasons, social distancing being one of them, but crucially it aided capacity, which is a major issue for restaurants at the moment, especially, well, of course, at times of social distancing. And as a result, we have been able to double and sometimes triple the capacity of restaurants by supporting them extending into the public highway or onto our own private land. Secondly, these terraces, they help create an atmosphere on the street and encourage people to dwell, which helps the businesses around them. And crucially, this helped bring back consumer confidence, which was at an all-time low and was a major barrier to bringing people back onto the retail streets. Coupled with this through the summer, we saw the success of the government Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which was hugely successful and a lifeline to many of our restaurant businesses, many of whom actually traded very well through that period. And so as a landlord, we took the rather unusual step to continue funding this scheme ourselves through September. And it's interesting to see the impact of this. So for example, in September, we are seeing some of our streets where we're supporting our restaurant tenants showing 5% above average footfall compared to the West End. Whereas prior to the scheme, we were seeing 5% below. And of course, there are multiple factors that play there, but this scheme is undoubtedly a key driver of that. Secondly, we created a partnership with Near Street, which you may or may not have heard of, which is an online tool that drives footfall to retailers and high streets by helping brands showcase live in-store inventory for shoppers searching nearby. And this is especially useful for us, given that 2/3 of our retailers in Mayfair and Belgravia are independent, and they don't have access to some of these complex online platforms, which some of the much larger players have access to. And for example, in week one, we saw products from the first 3 brands of ours on the Near Street platform. They were seen by almost 15,000 shoppers searching locally. And of course, we redoubled our marketing efforts. We have sustainably leafleted 65,000 households in a scheme called #FindYourBelgravia, talking about the businesses and the marketing events that we have going on in Belgravia. We have commissioned street art. We were sadly going to have music on the streets this week, which had to be cancelled as a result of the recent announcements. But we've launched a Sunday market in Eccleston Yards near Victoria. And we've been trying to bring culture outdoors at a time where the indoors is much more inaccessible. And we've also created flags on the street to just create a vibrant, which were done by interesting local artists, as a way of just bringing vibrancy onto the streets and having things for people to see and feel good about. I think it's a very obvious thing to say, but what we have seen more than anything is a very, very sharp quickening of trends that were already there. The first of which, of course, is the turn towards digital. The digital marketing now is more crucial than ever to reach people, and we have now put a huge emphasis on this, and to work much more closely together with our tenants to promote their businesses and relaunches and promotions and such like. As I've given a few examples of, we've turned towards a much more always-on approach to marketing, as they call it, where there are always small things to create constant interest and different reasons for customers to visit or feel good in our streets. We do everything now towards a sustainable recovery, whether that's pedestrian priority or conversion of car parking spaces to street uses, promoting cycle use, etc. And I think a really interesting trend, which was already there but is now is more important than ever, is the partnership approach between a landlord and a tenant, and especially in the retail sector. It's no longer a binary contractual relationship. It's all about working together and sharing in the good and bad times. And innovation. We have seen ourselves, we see the differences between those occupiers who innovate, who adapt or succeed in the face of adversity, and those who do bury their head in the sand or cling on to old ways of doing things. And there is going to be something quite Darwinian about this, but as they say, crisis breeds creativity. And it has been really great for us to see some of our occupiers innovate and find new opportunities within the crisis. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the future from now. So I hopefully painted, given a good picture of what we have done so far to help our estate and its businesses through. But what is very clear, and it's a bit of an obvious thing to say, but just how much central London relies on business workers and tourists. And we see that, for example, in the difference in footfall between our streets. So some of the streets in Belgravia that are much more heavily reliant on residential custom, where we're seeing now just a drop in of about 25% in footfall, compared to other parts of the West End, which are still seeing 75% falls in footfall compared to this time last year, as a result of the lack of commuters and tourists. This is a key challenge for central London. So what we have done, which I think has been implicit through some of the things I've said, is we have, of course, turned towards local trade. So we've shifted our marketing focus towards local residents and wider Londoners. And there are 10 million of us, so there is some hope. And many of those examples, such as Eat Out to Help Out, local marketing, near street, the cultural activities, they are all tailored to bringing Londoners back onto their own streets. But, even before the announcement this week, offices in the West End were broadly at around 20% capacity, and we've seen all the news of stations being at less than 50% capacity. And we were doing everything we could to try to entice office workers back onto the streets. And that was it, even before this week's announcement, there were huge barriers to that, such as the fear of public transport, which we saw in Erica's presentation, the cost of commuting, and other large barriers that really need government or institutional intervention. So this latest news of this week has really dealt central London a massive blow, as it continues to remove a key customer base for the foreseeable future. And we need these workers to return to the streets, start plugging the gap to restore real long-term viability to our occupiers. And of course, it's not just numbers of people, it's about spend. Spend is driven largely in many parts of the West End by international tourism. And so we are going to have to find ways of surviving until London can bring back its core customer groups. This will undoubtedly put even more strain on everyone, including ourselves. However, we will have to work through this and figure out the right response. And talking to other landlords over the last few days, there is no magic solution to the latest news. So we will need to what we will need is resolve, ingenuity, and a level of sacrifice to see this through. And I suppose the good thing is, for all those who are successful in surviving on the occupier side, on the landlord side, we will be all the stronger for it. Greater understanding of digital, greater connection to our London customer base, greater relationships between the landlords and tenants. But depending on how long this lasts, it's fair to say that not everyone will be able to hold on forever. And on that, I think I am handing back to Diane for questions.
Thanks, Paul, and everybody. That was great. So we've had a few questions come in already. So the first one is for Nicola from Emily Miller, who asks if your survey has been undertaken yet to establish what people want from the high street.
No, Emily, it's in the process of being written at the moment. and it will hopefully go out in the next few weeks. We're just having to be very careful about what we ask and what we think is deliverable, and what we control and what we can't control.
Okay. And a question for Paul about Grosvenor's plans. So how are you looking to continue outdoor dining during autumn and winter? It's something that Camden are currently looking into, so they're quite interested to hear about your plans.
Yes, so we're looking at it into it at the moment, and it's one where, of course, we need to work very closely with the council and local stakeholders. Interestingly, it was only yesterday that the outdoor table licenses that Westminster had granted, they were until the end of September, and they've just been extended until the end of October. And it is, you know, it's a bit of a conundrum, to be quite honest. We want to do it sustainably, so just having patio heaters outdoors is not a sustainable solution to this. And as the weather becomes more inclement, and that restrictions have now been put on the hospitality industry to close earlier, which for many of them will prevent a second service, there are clear capacity issues to that. So what we will try to, you know, help our terraces be as hospitable as possible going through the winter period. And you do look at other examples around the world. You know, Scandinavia keep their terraces open in the winter, and their weather is a lot worse than ours. Paris do the same, and they are also cracking down on outdoor heaters for sustainability reasons. So it can be done. Culturally, it's probably not in the London or English psyche, and there will be an adjustment for people to get round it. And I think there will be a little bit of a find our way through and see what works, and try out a number of different initiatives with our various occupiers to manage as best we can and find, you know, what the long-term solution is.
To find a good quality blanket maker within Belgravia.
In order to do. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question perhaps for Erica, might be best placed on this one, in terms of what do you see as longer term trends and what changes may stick, which, I mean, certainly everybody can jump into, but I'm just thinking Erica in the Centre for London Data has probably got a wider view.
Yeah, thanks, Deanne. That's a really good question. No one can really predict the future. And I think from our understanding of the data and from the trends that we've identified, the trends that will stick really do depend on how long the kind of the period without a vaccination lasts, how long, say, if we're entering into another lockdown period, how long that lockdown period lasts. And there are lots of uncertainties around that. And I think there's already been some survey work done on how people feel about working remotely, and how likely they are to continue working remotely. And all of this is really determined by how long they're asked to work remotely for. So it's very hard to say which trends will stick, because it's a very fast moving environment. But I think one to certainly watch is that shift to remote working, and the way that kind of changes behaviour in the long term. And we're also seeing people becoming increasingly interested in how their local areas are and what their local areas provide them. And that's obviously that's kind of influenced by the shift to remote working as well. So we're seeing all of these changes happen. But I think, as I said, and without wanting to repeat myself, the ones that will stick are really dependent on how long this all lasts for.
And Nicola and Paul, have you got anything to add from the many things that you've both talked about happening in your local neighbourhoods? So we're sort of looking at longer term trends and changes that may stick from the many things that you've been seeing and doing.
Well, we obviously hope in Putney that people continue to embrace shopping locally, but obviously we've got to deliver what they want to make sure that they keep coming. And we don't want people to continue to shop online. We obviously are well aware that online shopping has increased. It was going to increase anyway. It was on, you know, an upper trajectory. But we want to try and continue to encourage people to go and explore their high streets. But likewise, we know that businesses have got to get on board, and some of this, as Paul was mentioning, the smaller independents were perhaps in the worst position. And they do need to embrace digital technology to make sure that they have got a chance to survive in the future.
And you've been using Shop Happy or another platform in Putney?
Yeah, so we actually 2 weeks into lockdown, we started using the Shop Happy platform, which was originally built for a small village. I think it's a village in Yorkshire. And the idea was that all the people were going to work in the day, and so they were unable to use their local facilities, but they really wanted to. So you could order online and then collect them from the local pub on your way home. So it was a win-win for the pub because people had to go in there, and all the local shops would deliver the various different packages to the pub during the day. They obviously adapted it during lockdown very quickly, and so we had any business, small business, could get on there very quickly just by photographing their products, and then we offered a delivery service, so within 2 miles of Putney. And it was brilliant for some of the small businesses. It was, it did mean that they continued to trade, even if it was quite a small amount, but it became a little bit, it did mean that the business owner had to be in the business, and they weren't necessarily making enough money to warrant them being in the business to wait for the order to come in. So we need to look at it again and try and improve the way that it works so that it's got so that it can be viable in the future.
It's probably another good example of how it is sort of a live situation, really, and things that work in perhaps the initial lockdown months. When everything starts changing again, they perhaps need a little tweaking for the next phase of whatever's ahead. And Paul, did you have anything to add in terms of things that you think will be longer term or changes that might stick?
Yeah, so I think I can just echo some of the points that Erica and Nicola have made. I think Erica's point in that we don't have a crystal ball is quite a crucial one, and there are some very vehement opinions that you see in the press and such like of what the future will be for certain sectors and for offices. And the reality is there is quite a lot of mixed signals in the market at the moment, and we just don't know. So some people will undoubtedly downsize, some people might actually upsize because they might want more space in their offices. I think currently businesses are reacting in different ways, and what the long-term trend is currently unclear. Definitely changes to working patterns of offices, and what businesses expect or want from an office will change as well. That importance of bringing people together for collective thought and for discussion, and the importance of well-being in an office environment will obviously be just two key trends that we will continue to see, and what the local area also offers to those office workers coming in as a fun, an enjoyable place to come and work and meet people. On the retail side, yes, I mean, I agree with everything Nicola said. Businesses will need to embrace omni-channel. That digital is here to stay, and you really have to embrace it now. And we've seen that with the sink or swim of some of our occupiers, that you need to understand digital and not reject it. That is, you have to do both, and you have to. The trend towards shopping locally, I think that will stay for the foreseeable future, but also the importance of experience, that as the online, people's the habits are already there and they're already changing, and it's just been accelerated. But the importance of experience on the high street, how does it make you feel? Why do you go there? What leisure opportunities are there for you? How might you spend your time there? You might pop into one place and then go and do something else. As you pop into a shop, it might be more for an experience or to browse or to gain more knowledge of a brand. It might not be a transaction. But again, these are all things that were already happening. This isn't anything new. It's just a very quick acceleration of some of the things that we were already tackling.
If I might just jump in,
yeah.
I think, you raised some really good points, Paul. And we're actually looking we're conducting some work at the moment at the centre into what people want from their local high streets. It's somewhat similar to some of the survey work that Nicola's doing. And we know that there's a really kind of strong support around this idea of a 15-minute city. It's very well adopted in Paris. Copenhagen's almost the original 15-minute city because it's so small. But we're looking into our own version of that in London, and what that 15-minute city idea might mean for some of London's town centres. As you say, how can we make the town centres more diverse? and in doing so make them more resilient to some of these longer term trends that you described as coming forward in the future. So we're looking to do more of that community town centres work as the months progress.
I would agree that the importance of community is more, well, it's more important than ever. Community and sustainability are they've come really to the forefront, which is a good thing.
Certainly, and I think some of the trends we've seen in transport as well have had some really positive knock-on effects on the environment. And we know that people are travelling more by bicycle, and travelling by bike is very low in carbon. So if we can encourage more people to do that across the capital, then it could be a really positive step for London. But having said that, at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of people return to their private vehicles. And I know our colleagues at TfL and at the Greater London Authority certainly don't want London's recovery to be a car-led recovery, although it is starting to look that way. So I think we need to all think about now how we can encourage the take-up of low carbon transport, and push that and encourage that, so that we don't have a reversion back to a congested, polluted capital.
Do you think, just picking up on a few mentions there of community, do you think there's some work to be done in sort of almost connecting with a new community? Because Nicola touched on how residents kind of deserted the high street sort of 20 years ago because the high street no longer served them. Paul's been doing some work in terms of the doorstep drop and quite a big marketing campaign. But, potentially you now have a different community around these high streets than the one that was there before.
I'll just jump in there. So we were very conscious about that, and we've done a few things to try and capture that audience, because we were very conscious that the people that were following us on social media especially were those that were already very engaged with Putney and the businesses that were there. And so we needed to try and find a way to capture the other people that lived in Putney and weren't. So we actually got the council to do a bit of a letter. So they did a letter drop to every resident, sort of encouraging them to look out for their local high street. And that was very positive. And we are also going to do a door drop. We don't have as much money as Grosvenor Estates, I'd imagine. So we've had to combine ours with a Christmas brochure. So ours is early in November. And so it's very much a take on, explore your high street. This is what we've got. Come and buy your Christmas presents, have your Christmas. We did actually mention Christmas parties. It hasn't gone to print. So we'll have to amend that and say it's small parties of 6.
So now, yeah.
For now, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody, anything else to add on that point?
No, just to agree with, oh, sorry, you go, Erica.
No, you jump in, Paul. Go ahead.
Just to say, yes, it is reconnecting us with our communities, and I think it's reconnecting the communities with their streets. We have long struggled with local amenity on our estate because it just hasn't been viable. There are fewer resident numbers, and the residents don't necessarily shop that way. And I think people are rediscovering their local high streets or their local shops that they hold dear, they like to walk past, but they haven't necessarily gone into. And we are engaging a lot better with our local customer base, but also the London base, because by nature of the workers and the tourists not being there, who traditionally, of course, in central London drive the spend and the numbers. So yes, that is a positive, I think, for all concerned, amongst the general concern that sort of surrounds it.
We have another question that's sort of partly related, really, in terms of keeping local high streets viable. You might need to radically increase the number of homes around high streets. Is this possible? Even it might not just be the homes, as Paul's just alluded to. Sometimes there's plenty of residential, but they're not customers that are connected with the street. But I guess taking it back to the original question, it's really about increasing numbers of homes in areas around the high streets. So I don't know who wants to answer. I guess some of this might be related to permitted development changes as well. And Nicola touched on what happened in Putney some years ago with offices changing to housing as well. So I don't know, what impact does anybody think that it might have if you add more housing around high streets?
So from our perspective, there's not an awful lot of space left to change now. But if if we do have more housing, we just need to make sure that it's housing. The problem that we had previously was luxury flats went in, and those were therefore sold to people that worked in central London or actually often worked overseas, and therefore they didn't do anything to the local spend. So we just need to be careful that that the people that we brought in did actually want to use the local high street.
And Erica, has there been much research on that in terms of sort of the volume of households or residents surrounding London's high streets and how connected they are? Or is that part of your new research that's coming?
Yeah, no, certainly. Well, we're certainly looking at that as part of this new project on community town centres. But I think from our previous work, we know that whilst London does need more housing, it also needs diverse high streets as well. And that's not to say they both can't be done in tandem. But I think we do need to do that carefully, so that any kind of growth in housing around high streets doesn't mean a loss of their diversity and their resilience.
Yeah, Paul, did you have anything further to add?
Yes, in that, of course, more homes will help, and what we're trying to do in the estate is to improve density of of people living there in order to bring more resilient and local regular custom to our stores. I think it's also important to bear in mind that this is short term, that sort of workers and tourists will return one day, and that they will use the streets again. And I think the way that we've approached some of these more local uses on our streets is to find ways in which bringing in concepts that aren't so specialised or that focus entirely on one minority customer group. It's sort of how do you provide uses that work for residents and workers alike, that have a broader spectrum of amenity on offer within one store, so that you can achieve the viability, that you can achieve that viability in one store, which until recently, as we've seen, a lot of amenity uses have been lost through central London for that reason.
And this is perhaps a related question that's come in from the attendees. They've addressed it to Paul, but I think it's probably one that Nicola can add to as well. The question is still whether any of your tenants are using this time to improve their offer in the hope that trade will return. So I guess that's already about high street businesses diversifying, pivoting, however we want to describe it. But I guess back in March they were doing it from a position of urgency and essential way to survive. I guess the next 6 months ahead, if that's how long it lasts, they've kind of got a brief window to think about what they do next. So I guess what are you both kind of seeing amongst that adaptation in high street businesses?
So from our perspective, we had quite a few businesses that took the opportunity to renovate whilst it was locked down. We actually found as well some of the small independent businesses that maybe had been there for 20 years and they had probably never had a holiday in 20 years, really took the opportunity. The government had told them to close, and they took the time to really look at their business plan, really see where they were taking the business, whether it was where it wanted to be. And I felt that they did come back renovated, to be honest. And that was positive. It was almost like they'd enjoyed being told to close. I know that sounds a bit funny because they were obviously making no money, but actually they had some headspace to really think about what they wanted. So that was great. I mean, amazing. The diversification that's gone on is absolutely amazing. There's businesses, these people are entrepreneurs and they really do look to see how they can survive. And we've seen some great examples of things that have happened, and they will continue. And I think Paul alluded to it earlier, and it's something that we've been saying. It really has been a case of survival of the fittest. And those businesses that were good before lockdown have now become brilliant. And the businesses that were struggling, sadly, are the ones that we've had casualties. And
do you have a favourite example in terms of the ones who've diversified or come back better?
Well, we've had an estate agent that has started doing bike maintenance. Not estate agent, I don't mean estate agent, I mean dry cleaners that have become doing bike maintenance. So dry cleaning industry has pretty much gone. People aren't having their suits cleaned or their shirts ironed. And meanwhile, his neighbour was a cycling shop who was absolutely overwhelmed and couldn't keep up with demand, and still now struggling to get bikes in. But everyone wanted to have their bike serviced, and they just didn't have enough space, and so they joined forces together. And it's kept his rent. He's been able to pay his rent. He's been able to pay himself. So it's kept him going, because there's absolutely no way he would have been able to. So yeah, good.
And some nice collaboration by the sounds of it as well with his neighbour. So
yeah, and that's I think that's one of the things as well, that the small businesses were so busy running their businesses that they didn't often have time to speak to their neighbours. And they really have joined together, and they want each other all to be successful, and so they will do everything to help each other, which is it's built a much better, stronger community amongst the businesses, which is one of the positives that we've seen.
And Paul, any businesses within Belgravia that kind of spring to mind?
Well, I just echo everything that Nicola said. I think that's probably true everywhere, but it is survival of the fittest, and we've, the great have got greater, and those who were struggling beforehand are struggling even more. And I'm trying to think of examples we've had. I mean, there have been some great examples of ingenuity. We've had Pizza Pilgrims, for example, who just let on Buckingham Palace Road opposite Victoria Station, who with their closed kitchens decided to create mail order pizzas that you could cook at home. And they ended up in 10 Downing Street with a photo shoot with Boris.
Right.
So there've been plenty of examples of that, especially the restaurant businesses innovating in order to sort of create other ways of generating turnover. As Nicola said, diversification within stores, personal, a much more personal approach to shopping in order to entice people in and increase conversion. I mean, it's really nice to see, the strength in the face of adversity of some of our occupiers, and undoubtedly they will survive and they get stronger as a result.
Just to build on that point, Paul, we were exploring in some of our work, looking at central London, looking at some of these creative ideas, and we saw some great examples come out of restaurants that were offering space to emerging chefs. And we're teaming up with like pop-up restaurants and kind of renting out their kitchen space. And we'd just love to see more of that. And we put some recommendations forward to try and encourage that take up of space by, say, younger professionals or younger businesses, businesses that might not have been able to enter into that market before the crisis. So I think it's important to kind of look at some of the opportunities that might have arisen as well, and look at how we can use some of that, perhaps some of that vacancy or some of that, some of those kind of business closures to welcome in new emerging markets.
I think it's in quite a lot of mentoring type programs have started up as well, both with sort of people who were furloughed, working with charities and startups, and then sort of other university programs, which again is quite a good way of looking positively at the future as to how you can kind of bring through those next round of businesses, really, as I'm sure it's much harder to start right now. We will end with a very much a killer question that's coming on from the audience, which is a question to all of you about how optimistic are you about this time next year? So obviously this week we've heard that new restrictions can be in place for 6 months. So this is a good question in terms of actually it's not dwelling on the next 6 months or however long the current scenario might be, it's thinking a year out. So who wants to kick off with the answer first? We won't hold you to it, it's a very moving, very moving situation. So I guess it's at this moment in time, how do you feel about this time next year?
So I was going to say, I mean, my opinion has changed quite a bit as a result of the announcement 2 days ago. But this time last week, I was feeling quite optimistic that I was beginning to see a lot of resurgence in the markets, that we had, we're going under offer on lettings again on the high street, and that people are interested from all sectors. It's coming back, that the footfall was on the rise, that some of those trickier trading issues were beginning to go away. Clearly, central London especially, we've been dealt a massive blow now, and so the next 6 months are going to be very hard, and our key priority will be, of course, to avoid void on the streets and keep them alive. I am optimistic. I think that this will make London stronger, and that those who do get through will be all the stronger for it. But the next 6 months are going to be very hard, and it's going to be a tough road to get there.
Okay, Erica, with your access to a wealth of data, can you, are you of the same opinion, or you have a slightly different one?
It's a brilliant question. I must say, actually, I don't want to keep plugging our work at Centre for London, but today we published our huge London Futures report that looked into a lot of these subjects. So just thinking about some of the headlines that came from that, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm an optimist, so I will be optimistic. And I think you can already see that people are thinking about how London can recover greener from this crisis, which I think stands us in really good stead for the future. I don't know where that will put us in a year's time, but I think, in the longer term, London will emerge more resilient from this crisis. There are so many people working tirelessly, like day in, day out, to try and allow and help London to build back stronger, and to weather this period of downturn. So I feel like people are very invested in London, and are very invested in seeing it kind of thrive in the future. And we're thinking strategically about how we can use this crisis to kind of become a more resilient city in the long term. So I think, in summary, I am optimistic about where we'll be in a year's time, but I don't know where we'll be. I just hope that and feel that we might be in a stronger position to tackle some of the larger challenges that will come our way.
Nicola, how do you feel about that question in relation to Putney?
Well, I'm also an optimist. If I wasn't, I probably couldn't be doing my job. So, and actually, I've learned more through the last 6 months of just how positive I am, actually, and how other people deal with the situation. I would love to say that this time next year we'll be planning massive Christmas celebrations. And we'll all be able to have lots of fun with family and friends. I think it's going to be a very tough year. I think in Putney we had lots of businesses that were hiding the pain, thinking that we were coming out of lockdown, and that's why I say this week has been difficult, because I think the next, now knowing what we've got to get through for the next 6 months it has sort of been a bit of an awakening. So let's hope we get through the next 6 months. Let's hope we get through the next 9 months, and that we're in a better place. In Putney, we were beginning to struggle as a retail town, and I do feel like this has become an opportunity for us to really waken up the local residents and make them realise that if they want to have animated streets, if they want to have shops on their high street, then they really do have to use them, and they have to take that personal responsibility on. Because without them, we can't survive.
I think it's a nice point to end on, and great that all three of you are optimistic. Much as it's an unknown year ahead, it's nice to end on that optimistic note. So thank you for joining us. So we've had on our panel Nicola Grant from Positively Putney B.I.D, Erica Belcher from Centre for London, and Paula Grady from Grosvenor. There's plenty more London Society events online, from talks, workshops and a planning school, all taking place. And hopefully we will see you all again at another talk. Thank you for joining us.